Shaq stepped into the cafe just looking for a quiet cup of coffee. But then, "Shouldn't you be back in Africa?" The voice dripped with arrogance. The room froze. Eyes darted between Shaq and the wealthy woman, who had just humiliated herself. Cameras were already rolling. But instead of anger, Shaq just smiled. He had a plan. And what he did next? It would destroy her reputation, shake the internet, and turn this moment of hate into something unforgettable. Stay until the end, because this is a lesson she never saw coming. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Shaq stepped into the cafe, the warm scent of espresso wrapping around him like a familiar comfort. He had been looking forward to this, a rare, quiet morning before the chaos of meetings, calls, and obligations. The bell above the door chimed softly as he walked in, his towering frame instantly drawing eyes. Some customers whispered, nudging their companions. Others lifted their phones, pretending not to take pictures. Shaq was used to it. Fame had its price, and usually he didn't mind. But today was different. He approached the counter, his deep voice calm as he ordered a simple black coffee. The barista, a young man in his early 20s, nodded eagerly, trying to suppress his excitement. "On the house, Mr. O'Neill," he said with a nervous chuckle. Shaq smiled but insisted on paying. He never liked taking things for free. As he moved to a corner table, scrolling through his phone, the hum of conversation slowly resumed. But not everyone was thrilled by his presence. Across the cafe, Victoria Kensington sat at a table draped in luxury. Chanel clutch, diamond bracelet, perfectly manicured nails tapping against her wine glass. She was the kind of woman who had spent her life being catered to, her world carefully curated, to keep out anything or anyone she deemed unworthy. And right now, she had decided that Shaq was unworthy. She took a slow sip of her overpriced Chardonnay, her icy blue eyes scanning him with thinly veiled disdain. With a slight smirk, she leaned toward her equally well-dressed friend, speaking just loud enough for the words to carry. "This place used to have standards," she murmured. "Now just anyone can walk in." Her friend, a woman who looked just as wealthy but slightly less hateful, stiffened uncomfortably. "Victoria," she started. But Victoria wasn't done. She placed her glass down, stood up, and walked toward Shaq's table, her heels clicking against the marble floor with practiced elegance. The cafe quieted as she approached, the weight of unspoken tension pressing down on the air. Shaq, still oblivious, sipped his coffee, waiting for his next email to load. Then the words came. "Shouldn't you be back in Africa?" The entire cafe froze. Silverware clinked against plates as someone nearly dropped their fork. A waiter, mid-step, hesitated, eyes flickering between Shaq and Victoria. Conversations died instantly, the soft jazz music playing overhead suddenly feeling too loud. Shaq didn't move. For a long, thick moment, he just sat there, fingers resting against the handle of his coffee cup. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his gaze, locking eyes with the woman who had just insulted him. Victoria smirked, waiting for a reaction. Maybe anger. Maybe an outburst, something to confirm her belief that men like him didn't belong in places like this. But Shaq? He just smiled. A slow, knowing, dangerous smile. A phone camera clicked. Someone was recording. The moment was captured. But what happened next? No one in that cafe was ready for it. The internet caught everything. And now, the world was watching. The cafe had fallen into an eerie silence after Victoria Kensington's words left her lips. A few patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others lowered their gazes, pretending they hadn't heard anything. But the damage was already done. At a corner table, a young man with a phone in his hand sat frozen, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. He had captured the entire exchange on video, his camera steady, his fingers shaking slightly as he replayed the clip. The audio was crystal clear. Shaquille O'Neal, one of the most respected athletes in the world, had just been told to go back to Africa by a wealthy white woman who had spoken without an ounce of hesitation. His heart pounded. He had just recorded something big. He hesitated for only a second before his fingers moved. Rich woman tells Shaquille O'Neal to go back to Africa. Unbelievable. He tapped post. For a moment, nothing happened. Then his phone buzzed. Then again. And again. The vibrations turned into a rapid, endless stream as the tweet started spreading. retweets, likes, shares. It was moving too fast for his notifications to even keep up. His screen froze for a second before loading again, numbers jumping by the thousands every time he refreshed. It was happening. Within minutes, the video had been seen. By thousands. Within an hour, millions. The outrage spread like wildfire. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Every platform was flooded with reactions. Did she seriously just say that to Shaq? Victoria Kensington's career is over. She picked the worst possible person to say that to. This is 2024. How does this racism still exist? Hashtags began trending almost instantly. Cancel Victoria. Respect Shaq. Racism exposed. The news picked it up within the hour. Morning talk shows played the clip on repeat, debating the implications. Some called it shocking. Others called it predictable. Then celebrities joined in. NBA players, actors, musicians, everyone had something to say. Not Victoria Kensington thinking she can talk to Shaq like that. She done. Racism has no place here. Call her out. Shaq is unbothered, but we aren't. We see you, Victoria. And then, the moment that sealed it all, LeBron James, one of the most influential athletes in the world, tweeted a single line. Victoria Kensington, your racism is showing. Hope you're ready for what's coming. That was it. Victoria Kensington's name had become synonymous with hate. Meanwhile, inside the cafe, Victoria sipped her espresso, still blissfully unaware of the war raging against her online. Her friend Charlotte, scrolling through her phone, suddenly went pale. She gripped the edge of the table, her breath hitching. Victoria, she whispered, nudging her urgently. Victoria barely glanced up, swirling the last sip of her drink in its cup. What? She asked, annoyed by Charlotte's wide-eyed expression. Charlotte hesitated, then slowly turned her phone around. On the screen, Victoria saw her own face, frozen mid-sneer, the subtitles displaying the words that had just left her mouth. The caption was brutal. Rich white woman tells Shaquille O'Neal to go back to Africa. Her hands trembled as she reached for the phone, her stomach twisting. The number of views at the bottom of the post made her vision blur. Hundreds of thousands. No, millions. Her espresso cup slipped from her fingers, shattering against the pristine marble floor. A waiter rushed over, but she didn't even notice. Her hands gripped her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her name was everywhere. Every comment, every repost, every call for her to be held accountable. Her world had just turned upside down. Across the room, Shaq remained seated, sipping his coffee calmly, as if he hadn't just been insulted on a global stage. He had seen the video trending, seen the reactions flooding in, but he hadn't responded. And that was intentional. The media was expecting him to lash out, to make a fiery statement, to call Victoria out himself. But he had a different plan. His phone buzzed. It was his agent. He answered, bringing the phone to his ear. Shaq, you're not going to believe what's happening. She thought she was untouchable. She was wrong. Victoria Kensington had spent her entire life believing she was above consequences. Money had always shielded her. Power had always protected her. And connections had always ensured that no matter what she did, she could walk away untouched. But not this time. The moment she checked her phone, her world caved in. Hundreds, no, thousands of notifications flooded her screen. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Even her email inbox was overflowing. Every post, every tag, every comment was a dagger aimed straight at her reputation. Her name was trending worldwide. Not for her charity work. Not for her high society status. But for racism. Victoria Kensington exposed. The elite's ugly truth finally comes to light. Shaq handled it with class. But Victoria, she's done. She scrolled, her breath shallow, her fingers trembling. Her perfectly curated online persona, years of carefully crafted images, extravagant vacations, and designer collaborations, was being reduced to a joke. The brands, one by one, they started cutting ties. She clicked on her Instagram, where just yesterday she had posted a glamorous ad for a luxury skincare brand. The comments were now flooded with demands for the company to drop her. It had worked. We at La Belle Luxe do not tolerate hate or discrimination. Effective immediately, we are terminating our partnership with Victoria Kensington. Her stomach twisted. She backed out and checked her emails. Another one. Dear Ms. Kensington, due to recent events, We regret to inform you that our contract will not be renewed. More emails, more terminations, more endorsements slipping through her fingers. Then her phone rang. It was her PR agent. Victoria. The woman's voice was sharp, clipped with barely concealed panic. What did you do? Victoria's mouth opened, but no words came out. You don't understand, she finally managed. That video, it's taken out of context. I didn't mean... Her agent cut her off. It doesn't matter what you meant. You're radioactive. Sponsors are dropping you. The charity board is reconsidering your seat. And... A pause. A deep breath. You've been uninvited from the Kensington Gala. Victoria nearly dropped the phone. The Kensington Gala. Her family's legacy event. The crown jewel of her social status. An annual gathering of the richest, most influential people in the country. And they had uninvited her. She could barely breathe. They can't do that, she whispered. They already did. She stumbled to the couch, feeling dizzy. Then another notification lit up her phone. A message from Daniel, her son. For a second, relief flooded her. Finally, someone on my side. But then she read the text. Daniel. Mom, what did you do? Her breath hitched. Daniel. Do you have any idea what people are saying about you? My friends are sending me memes. Memes, Mom, this is humiliating. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. How could she explain? Before she could type, another text appeared. Daniel. I can't believe you said that to Shaq. Of all people, just fix this. Then 3 dots, a hesitation. And one last message. Daniel. Or don't bother calling me. The phone slipped from her hands. Her own son was ashamed of her. Desperation clawed at her. She had to do something. She had to fix this. She sat up straight, opened Twitter, and began typing. I deeply regret any misunderstanding that occurred today. My words were taken out of context, and I sincerely apologize if I offended anyone. I have always supported diversity and inclusion, and I will do better. Her finger hovered over the post button. Yes, this would work. People loved apologies. They would forgive her. They had to. She hit send. Within seconds, the backlash was brutal. If you offended someone, just say you're racist and go. Taken out of context? Sis, we heard you loud and clear. I support diversity. Yeah, okay, sure, try again. Her pathetic attempt at damage control had only made things worse. She shut her laptop, burying her face in her hands. Everything was slipping away. A knock at the door startled her. She jumped up, heart pounding. But it was just Charlotte. Her friend hesitated at the entrance, holding up her phone. You need to see this, Charlotte said quietly. Victoria took the phone with shaking hands. On the screen was a news broadcast. Breaking news. Shaquille O'Neal has finally spoken out after the viral incident involving Victoria Kensington. Victoria's stomach twisted. The camera cut to a press conference. Shaq stood in front of a row of microphones, dressed in a sleek navy blue suit. His expression was unreadable. Calm. Collected. Then he spoke, and Victoria's world shattered all over again. He wasn't angry. He had a plan. The world was waiting for Shaq to explode. The internet had already decided Victoria Kensington was finished. The media was devouring every detail of the scandal. Late-night talk shows mocked her. Social media memes shredded her, and public outrage grew by the hour. Everyone expected Shaq to strike back, but when he finally spoke, his response stunned everyone. The press conference was packed. Cameras lined the room, reporters eager to hear Shaq's response. As he stepped up to the podium, the flashes flickered like lightning. Shaq stood there, calm and composed, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit. His towering frame dominated the room, but his expression remained unreadable. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then he sighed. "Let me be clear," he began, his deep voice steady. "I'm not here to tear anybody down. I'm not here to start a war of words. I don't need to." The reporters leaned in, hungry for more. What happened in that cafe wasn't just about me. It wasn't just about one comment, one person. It's about something much bigger. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. This is about how we still live in a world where people think they can decide who belongs and who doesn't. This is about privilege. This is about racism. And this is about the idea that money can buy immunity from consequences. A murmur spread through the crowd. Shaq wasn't just addressing Victoria. He was exposing a system. But here's the thing, he continued, his voice firm. I don't waste my time on negativity. I don't fight hate with more hate. I do something bigger. He leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with the cameras. That's why today, I'm announcing a $5 million donation to youth mentorship programs, community centers, and scholarships for underprivileged kids. The room erupted. The news spread like wildfire. While Victoria had spent the last 24 hours scrambling to salvage her reputation, Shaq had just elevated himself beyond the conversation. TV headlines praised him. Shaq turns hate into hope, announces major community investment. Shaquille O'Neal responds to racist incident with grace and action. Shaq destroys Victoria Kensington, without saying her name. Instead of feeding the drama, he made her look even worse. Victoria had tried to reduce him with one ugly sentence. Shaq had just outclassed her in front of the entire world. At that very moment, across town, Victoria Kensington sat frozen in front of her television. Her face, pale and tense, reflected on the screen as Shaq's press conference played. She clenched her fists. How? How did this happen? He wasn't even attacking her. He wasn't calling for her to be canceled. He wasn't demanding revenge. He had simply ignored her and turned the spotlight toward something bigger. And somehow, that made it worse. Because now, it wasn't about her anymore. It was about what she represented. Victoria's son, Daniel, stood in the doorway, arms crossed. He had watched everything unfold from the beginning. But this was different. For years, he had defended his mother, making excuses for her behavior. She's just old-fashioned. She doesn't really mean it like that. She was raised differently. But there were no excuses now. He turned to his mother, his voice quiet but sharp. You did this to yourself. Victoria flinched, but Daniel wasn't done. You always talk about how important our family name is, how we have to maintain our image. Well, congratulations, Mom. You just destroyed it. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Daniel scoffed, shaking his head. You're not even mad at what you said. You're mad that people finally see you for who you really are. Then he turned and walked away. Victoria sat there, the weight of his words suffocating. For the first time in her life, she felt truly alone. Meanwhile, back at his office, Shaq leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the desk. The press conference had gone exactly as planned, but he wasn't done yet. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. It rang twice before a voice answered. You ready? Shaq asked. The voice on the other end chuckled. Oh, I've been ready. Shaq grinned. Good. Let's turn this up a notch. He ended the call. Victoria thought her life was falling apart now. She had no idea what was coming next. Victoria was about to lose more than just her reputation. Victoria Kensington had built her life on illusions. The grand estate, the designer clothes, the elite invitations, it was all a carefully crafted image, a performance she had perfected over decades. But what no one knew, what she had worked so hard to keep hidden, was that the entire empire she flaunted so arrogantly was crumbling beneath her. And today, the final piece was about to fall. The marble-floored halls of Victoria's mansion were eerily quiet. Gone were the days of extravagant galas and high-society luncheons. The staff had been let go, the luxury cars repossessed, and the once-stocked wine cellar sat empty. Victoria stood in the center of her grand living room, gripping a glass of whiskey with a shaking hand. Her lawyer's voice echoed in her ears. The foreclosure is final. The auction is in 2 days. There's nothing we can do. She had screamed, threatened, and begged, but it hadn't changed the facts. The banks had cut her off. Her business partners had distanced themselves. Her carefully curated social circle had all but disappeared. Now the house, the symbol of her power, was being taken from her. And the worst part? The whole world was about to watch it happen. The air inside the prestigious auction house was thick with anticipation. Victoria sat stiffly in the front row, dark sunglasses hiding the exhaustion in her eyes. She had dressed in her finest black dress, trying to appear unbothered, trying to convince everyone, including herself, that she still belonged in this world. But the whispers were deafening. She fell hard. 1 minute, she's running society. The next, she's losing everything. She did it to herself. She clenched her jaw, refusing to react. The auctioneer took his place at the podium, adjusting his microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Today we begin the bidding for the Kensington Estate, a one-of-a-kind luxury home located in the heart of Beverly Hills. We will start at $5 million. Paddles shot up instantly. 6 million. 7. 9 million. The numbers climbed rapidly, investors hungry to snatch up the fallen socialite's prized possession. Victoria's nails dug into her palms. Each bid felt like another nail in her coffin. Then, a new voice cut through the room. 20 million. Silence. Heads turned. The auctioneer nearly choked on his own breath. And then Victoria saw him, Shaquille O'Neal, standing in the back of the room, arms crossed, completely at ease. Her stomach dropped. The murmurs exploded. Wait, Shaq is here? He's buying our house? Oh, this is brutal. The auctioneer cleared his throat. We have a bid of $20 million. Any higher offers? Silence. Even the wealthiest bidders knew better than to challenge Shaq's pockets. Going once. Victoria gripped the arms of her chair, heart pounding. Going twice. She shot to her feet. No! But the gavel had already fallen. Sold. To Mr. O'Neal. Victoria stormed through the crowd, fury burning in her. Your chest, you can't do this, she spat, stopping inches from Shaq. This is my home. Shaq looked down at her, expression unreadable. Not anymore, he said simply. Her chest tightened. The cameras were flashing, the world watching as she stood there, powerless, humiliated, and completely at his mercy. And for the first time in her life, Victoria Kensington had nothing left to say. She lost everything. But Shaq wasn't done teaching her a lesson. Victoria Kensington had spent her entire life believing money could fix anything, that her name carried power, that people like her would always land on their feet. But as she stood in the grand marble foyer of the mansion that was no longer hers, staring at the man who had just taken everything from her, she felt something she hadn't felt in decades: fear. Her throat was dry. The cameras outside flashed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, capturing every second of her humiliation. News reporters crowded at the gates, eager to catch a glimpse of the fallen socialite. She swallowed her pride. Shaquille, she started, forcing a tight-lipped smile. There's no need for all of this. I'm sure we can work something out. Shaq raised an eyebrow, leaning against the marble staircase. Work something out? He repeated, his voice calm, measured. She nodded quickly. Yes, of course. You're a businessman. Surely we can come to a mutual agreement. You don't really need this house, do you? I could buy it back from you. Double the price. She tried to keep her voice steady, but her desperation cracked through. Shaq didn't even blink. Double the price? He let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. Victoria, you don't have a dime to your name. The words hit like a slap. She sucked in a sharp breath, her hands balling into fists. Please, she tried again, her voice quieter this time. This is my home. Shaq's expression darkened, and when he spoke, his voice was firm. This was never your home. This was a palace built on arrogance, a symbol of everything wrong with people like you. And now, he gestured toward the massive chandelier above them. It's going to mean something real. 2 days later, the media was buzzing. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just keeping the mansion, he was turning it into something the world would never forget. A youth center for underprivileged kids. The extravagant ballroom where Victoria once hosted exclusive parties, converted into a mentorship hall where young kids could meet successful professionals who looked like them, who came from backgrounds like theirs, who could teach them how to break into industries that had once shut them out. The tennis courts, now a massive free-for-all basketball camp, a place where kids who had never been given a shot could play, train, and dream. The mansion's lavish dining halls, transformed into a food bank and outreach center for struggling families. And at the heart of it all, Shaq made one thing clear. Victoria's wealth had never made her powerful. True power was in giving back. The response was immediate. News headlines called it, the greatest power move in history. Shaq takes racist woman's mansion and gives it to the people. Victoria Kensington's fall from grace continues. Now her home belongs to the kids. She ignored. Social media exploded with praise. This is how you handle racism, not with hate, but with action. Victoria thought she was better than everyone. Now her house belongs to the very people she looked down on. Shaq is a legend. This isn't just a win. It's a legacy. Meanwhile, Victoria was nowhere to be found. She had become a national joke. Her name was forever tied to the scandal. Her reputation in shambles. Former friends stopped returning her calls. Brands distanced themselves. High society events that once begged for her presence now acted like she never existed. And while the world laughed at her downfall, she sat alone in a small rented apartment, watching the news unfold. But she wasn't the only one watching, because in the middle of the press conferences, the celebrations, and the public redemption of her former home, someone else was paying attention. Daniel Kensington, Victoria's son, stood just outside the newly transformed youth center. He watched as kids ran across what used to be his family's private driveway. He saw families walk into the mansion, not for a lavish party, but for help, for opportunity, for a chance at something better. And for the first time in his life, he questioned everything. Everything his mother had taught him. Everything she had believed in. As he looked toward the man who had single-handedly destroyed his family's legacy and turned it into something greater, Daniel felt something stir inside him. Admiration, regret, and the sudden terrifying realization that maybe, just maybe, Shaquille O'Neal wasn't the villain in this story. Maybe his mother was. I don't want to be like you. Victoria Kensington had spent her entire life controlling the narrative. In every room, at every social event, she was the one people admired, feared, or envied. But now, as she sat alone in her dimly lit apartment, the news blaring on the TV in front of her, she realized she had lost control of the one thing that mattered most, her son. Daniel Kensington wasn't just walking away from her. He was running straight toward Shaquille O'Neal. The footage was everywhere. News anchors couldn't stop talking about it. Daniel Kensington, once the privileged heir to a crumbling empire, had been spotted working at the newly transformed youth center, the very mansion that once belonged to his family. The camera followed him as he handed out basketballs to eager kids, laughing with them, engaging with their stories. Shaq stood beside him, a proud but reserved presence. He wasn't forcing Daniel into anything. The young man had come on his own. A reporter held a microphone up to him. "Daniel, why are you here?" He glanced at Shaq, then at the kids playing behind him, before turning back to the camera. "Because it's time I do something that actually matters." His voice was steady, but his words sent shockwaves through social media. The interviewer pressed further. "Your mother has been facing immense backlash. Are you here to support her?" Daniel's jaw tightened. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Then, with a quiet but firm voice, he said, "I love my mother, but I don't want to be like her." Gasps rippled through the audience watching at home. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. This couldn't be happening. The headlines wrote themselves. Victoria Kensington's son turns his back on her. Daniel chooses Shaq's youth center over his own family. Social media erupted with reactions. Even her own son doesn't want to be associated with her. That's gotta hurt. Daniel choosing Shaq over his racist mother is the best thing I've seen all week. This is what growth looks like. Respect to Daniel for breaking the cycle. Victoria felt her hands shaking as she scrolled through the comments. Her son was supposed to inherit her legacy. He was supposed to defend her, to stand by her side. Instead, he was helping the very people she had spent her life looking down on. And the worst part? She couldn't stop him. The youth center continued to flourish, and Daniel became one of its most dedicated volunteers. He spent his days mentoring kids, teaching them skills he had once taken for granted. He used his business connections to set up scholarship programs. He even started a mentorship program for young entrepreneurs from struggling communities. Reporters kept asking about his mother, but he refused to let her define him. "I'm not here to talk about her," he told one journalist. "I'm here to make a difference." But the message was clear. Daniel Kensington was no longer his mother's son. He was his own person now. For the first time in her life, Victoria Kensington was irrelevant. Her social circle had abandoned her. Her invitations to high-profile events had vanished. Her name was now a stain, a reminder of everything wrong with the elite class. And her son, her own flesh and blood, had chosen a path that no longer included her. So when a journalist showed up at her door, microphone in hand, she hesitated. "Ms. Kensington, would you like to tell your side of the story?" Her fingers tightened around the doorknob. This was her chance. A chance to reclaim her image. A chance to fight back. a chance to change the narrative. But as she looked past the reporter, her eyes landed on the TV screen inside her apartment. Footage of Daniel, smiling as he played basketball with a group of kids, flashed across the screen. And for the first time, Victoria wondered if maybe, just maybe, she was the villain in her own story. Victoria takes a deep breath. Does she fight, or finally admit the truth? She tried to spin the narrative. It backfired. Victoria Kensington had spent her entire life controlling the way people saw her. From exclusive charity galas to high-profile social events, she had always been the woman others envied. Polished, powerful, untouchable. But now she was the villain. Sitting alone in the dimly lit dressing room of a major news studio, she stared at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her wasn't the confident socialite she once was. Dark circles clung beneath her eyes, barely concealed by layers of expensive makeup. Her manicured hands, always steady, trembled as she adjusted her pearl necklace. This was her last chance to fix everything. The door creaked open and her PR agent, a sharp-dressed woman named Meredith, stepped inside. Her expression was tight, her voice clipped. "Victoria, I need to remind you. Own the narrative." Victoria took a deep breath, nodding. She knew what she had to do. She had rehearsed it over and over. Play the victim. Blame the internet, the media, and most importantly, Shaq. She would make people feel sorry for her. Or at least, that was the plan. The interview started smoothly, at least on the surface. The host, a respected journalist named Anthony Reeves, introduced her to the audience. "Tonight, we're joined by Victoria Kensington, the socialite at the center of a controversy that has taken over the internet." Victoria forced a sad, weary smile as the camera zoomed in on her. She clasped her hands together, her voice trembling just enough to sound sympathetic. "This has been the most difficult time of my life," she began. "The internet took one moment out of context and destroyed everything I built. The media has twisted my words, and now I'm being punished for something I never meant to be offensive." Anthony tilted his head. "So, you're saying telling Shaquille O'Neal to go back to Africa was taken out of context?" A flicker of irritation crossed her face, but she quickly masked it. "I was simply expressing—" She hesitated, scrambling for words. "That certain spaces have changed. It wasn't meant to be malicious." Anthony didn't blink. "So, when you called him out in the middle of the cafe, loudly enough for the entire room to hear, that wasn't meant to be offensive?" Victoria swallowed hard. He cut her off. "And what about the video of you laughing afterward?" A low murmur spread through the audience. Victoria's hands clenched under the table. The moment the interview aired, the internet exploded. Clips of Victoria dodging questions spread across social media. Within hours, memes flooded Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. It was taken out of context as rich, coming from someone who was recorded in 4K. Victoria Kensington playing the victim when she was the one being racist? Girl, bye. The way Anthony just stared at her when she tried to explain herself. I felt that. The hashtags were brutal. Victoria Kensington is over. Accountability. Not apologies. Respect Shaq. Victoria thought people would sympathize with her. Instead, they mocked her. Brands that had once partnered with her now rushed to distance themselves. The elite social circles that had welcomed her before, silent. The final blow came when her own lawyer dropped her as a client. "We're reevaluating our relationship with Ms. Kensington in light of recent events." Victoria sat in her penthouse, staring at her phone as one by one. Every bridge she had built in high society burned to the ground. Her financial situation was already crumbling after Shaq bought her mansion. Now, with lawsuits piling up and sponsors pulling out, she was officially broke. Paparazzi followed her for days, hoping to catch another meltdown. But Victoria didn't give them the satisfaction. One night, in the dead of night, she vanished. No more press releases, no more desperate interviews, just gone. Broke and humiliated, Victoria disappears from the public eye. The mansion was no longer a symbol of wealth, it was now a symbol of hope. The sun hung high over the Langley estate, but it wasn't the same estate it used to be. Gone were the gilded gates that once kept people out. The towering pillars, once symbols of exclusivity, now stood as welcoming beacons to anyone who needed a safe space. The sprawling mansion, once filled with extravagant parties and elite guests, had been completely transformed. Today, it wasn't a home of arrogance. It was a home of opportunity. A massive banner stretched across the entrance. The Kensington Youth Empowerment Center. A place for all. Shaquille O'Neal stood at the gates, watching as waves of people flooded inside. Families from struggling neighborhoods, single mothers holding their children's hands, wide-eyed kids looking around in awe. There were local activists, former athletes, and even celebrities who had come to support the initiative. What once had been Victoria Kensington's playground for the rich was now a safe haven for the people she once ignored. And it was only the beginning. Inside, the estate had been unrecognizably rebuilt. The grand dining hall where Victoria had once hosted luxury dinners, now a cafeteria serving free meals to children in need. The once restricted indoor gym, now a fully accessible sports training center where kids could play without limits. The ballroom, once reserved for high society events, turned into a mentorship and career-building center. Everywhere Shaq looked, he saw lives being changed. Kids laughing, teenagers signing up for programs, parents speaking with volunteers about resources. This was bigger than a revenge story. This was legacy. Cameras flashed as Shaq stepped onto the outdoor stage, facing a crowd of hundreds. He adjusted the microphone, then scanned the sea of faces that weren't supposed to be here, people who had never been welcomed into places like this before. Shaq took a deep breath. His voice was deep, steady, and full of conviction. "Hate never wins," he said. "But kindness? That's how you change the world." The crowd erupted in cheers. Reporters captured the moment, broadcasting it to millions. Social media exploded with clips from the speech. Shaq had done the impossible. He had flipped the entire narrative. Instead of letting Victoria's racism define the story, he had taken her worst moment and turned it into a movement. The hashtags trended worldwide. Respect Shaq. Kindness wins. Hope over hate. The media called it one of the most powerful acts of justice in modern history. But while the world celebrated, someone else was watching. Parked just beyond the gates, a black sedan sat idle, its engine humming softly. Inside, Victoria Kensington gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her heart pounded as she watched through the tinted glass, seeing everything she had lost. Her mansion, her reputation, her status. But more than that, she saw something else, something she had never felt before. Regret. For the first time, she wasn't just angry. She wasn't just humiliated. She was alone. Her son, Daniel, stood in the crowd, beaming as he helped guide children into the new youth center. She saw him shaking hands with Shaq, talking to volunteers, thriving in the very space she had fought so hard to keep people out of. Victoria's breath hitched. She had always believed she was better than others, that her wealth, her social standing, her family name made her untouchable. But watching her son choose to be part of this change, watching him turn his back on everything she once stood for the first time, Victoria questioned everything. She wanted to get out of the car. She wanted to say something. She wanted to undo it all. But she couldn't, because deep down, she knew this was the bed she had made, and now she had to lie in it. A black sedan is parked outside. Victoria watches from a distance, unseen, and for the first time, she feels regret. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about change. Victoria Kensington's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel. The black sedan crawled forward through the quiet streets, away from what had once been her estate, the place where she had ruled over extravagant dinner parties, laughed with high society elites, and ensured that only the right kind of people ever stepped foot inside. But now, it belonged to them. Through the rearview mirror, she could still see the grand mansion, only it was no longer a mansion. The Kensington Youth Empowerment Center glowed brightly against the night sky, filled with laughter, joy, and hope, things that had never lived inside those walls before, and Shaquille O'Neal had done it all, without anger, without hatred, without ever needing to destroy her. Victoria felt her throat tighten. She had done this to herself. The last few weeks had been a nightmare. It wasn't just that she had lost her mansion. She had lost everything. Her bank accounts, frozen. Her business partnerships, gone. Her invitations to the most exclusive events, retracted. Her closest friends, nowhere to be found. But the worst part? Her son. Daniel had chosen Shaq over her. She could still hear his words, echoing like a cruel song in her mind. "I don't want to be like you." She clenched the wheel tighter. How had it come to this? She had spent her life making sure she was above people like Shaq. People who weren't born into wealth, who had to climb their way up instead of simply being handed the world on a silver platter. Yet here she was, a nobody. And Shaq? He was winning. Back at the center, the celebration continued. Reporters swarmed the courtyard, capturing every moment. But Shaq wasn't focused on the cameras. He was focused on the kids. Barefoot teenagers sprinted across the newly built basketball court, the sound of bouncing balls and sneakers screeching against the pavement filling the air. They had never played on a court like this before. Shaq, towering over them, grinned as he dribbled between his legs, letting them think they had a chance. A young boy, barely 10, puffed out his chest. "You scared, Shaq?" The crowd burst into laughter. Shaq feigned offense, placing a massive hand over his chest. "Oh, now you got jokes?" He chuckled. "All right then, let's see what you got." The boy darted forward, trying to steal the ball. Shaq easily spun away and went for a layup. The kids groaned in mock frustration, but they were having the time of their lives, because Shaq wasn't just some untouchable NBA legend to them. He was here, with them, playing with them, and that meant more than any victory in an arena ever could. As the sun dipped lower, Shaq stepped away from the court, wiping sweat from his brow. His assistant, Derek, approached with a phone in hand. "You've seen this, right?" Derek asked, scrolling through trending headlines. Shaq didn't even look. He didn't need to. Respect Shaq was still trending. News stations were still talking about what he had done. Victoria's downfall was still a national joke. But Shaq? He didn't care about any of that. Because this had never been about proving a point. It had never been about tearing Victoria down. It had always been about lifting others up. And he had done exactly that. Miles away, Victoria pulled into the dimly lit parking lot of a rundown motel. Her new home. She sat in the silence, staring blankly at the cracked windshield. She had lost. But somehow it wasn't Shaq she was angry at. It was herself. She thought about her mansion. No, the center. And how it was thriving in a way it never had when she had lived there. She thought about Daniel, smiling, happy, free. And for the first time, a bitter, painful truth settled in her chest. She had spent her whole life believing wealth made her untouchable. But Shaq had proven her wrong. Because real power? It wasn't about money. It was about what you did with it. And he had used his power to build something that would outlive them all. Back at the center, as the night sky settled over the city, Shaq stood at the entrance, arms crossed, watching as the last few families left. A reporter approached him hesitantly. "Shaq," she said, microphone in hand, "if you could say one final thing about everything that happened with Victoria Kensington, what would it be?" Shaq thought for a moment. Then he smiled and said the words that would be remembered forever. "You don't fight hate with hate. You fight it by lifting others up." The camera zoomed out, Shaq standing in front of his youth center, the sound of kids laughing in the background. A legacy built from something bigger than revenge. A legacy built from change.